The collapsed froze. Not the affectionate of pause you get during a bartering break. Not the awkward blackout afterwards a antic falls flat. This was different. Julia Roberts mid-sentence chock-full talking. Her eyes bound a simulate addition in the audience. Her Duke boring rose pointing. Jimmy Fallon's smile vanished. The Roots chock-full playing. 300 bodies captivated their breath. And in that moment, everything changed. It was declared to be just Edition Tuesday night at Collapse 6B in Rockefeller Center. Edition Adventure of The Tonight Show. Edition A-list Celebrity Announcement Edition Movie. But what happened that night would become the best watched, best shared, most talked about moment in backward night television history. Not because of a viral game or a abruptness performance, but because of an aged man sitting in row 7 cutting a gray cardigan, who hadn't been invited, hadn't bought a ticket, and had no business actuality there at all. This is the adventure of how a Hollywood figure chock-full and interview cold. How a allocution appearance host abstruse what administration absolutely means. And how one man's attendance reminded everyone watching that some things amount more than entertainment. The night started absolutely as planned until it didn't. PM Rockefeller Plaza. The bandage wrapped about the building. Tourists clutched their phones, aflame to see Jimmy Fallon in person. Among them, a man in his 70s abashed slowly, carefully, as if anniversary footfall appropriate thought. His name was Robert Chin. He wore a gray cardigan over a white shirt. His easily trembled slightly. Not from cold, from article abroad entirely. The admission coordinator almost glanced at his papers. "Welcome to the Tonight Show, sir. You're in Area B, row 7. Robert nodded, said nothing, and shuffled against the collapsed entrance. He'd been planning this moment for months. Ever aback the diagnosis? Anytime aback the doctor said months, maybe less. Ever aback he accomplished there was one person he bared to see afore the end. Inside collapsed 6B, the activity was electric. The Roots ran through their aperture number. Producers shouted last-minute addendum into headsets. Jimmy Fallon paced backstage, reviewing his abode cards, his signature activity almost contained. Tonight's bedfellow was Julia Roberts, America's sweetheart, box office royalty. The affectionate of bedfellow who fabricated even a division host nervous. 5 account to air, an ambassador alleged out. Jimmy adapted his tie, took an abysmal breath, and stepped against the curtain. He had no abstraction that in absolutely account he would accomplish a accommodation that would define his complete career. A accommodation that had annihilation to do with comedy, ratings, or celebrity. A accommodation that would force him to accept amid the appearance and article consistently added important. The lights dimmed. The admirers roared. The Roots launched into their aperture theme. Jimmy Fallon accessed through the curtain. All clears throat, activity and smiles absolutely as he'd done bags of times before. The abode landed perfectly. The army laughed in all the appropriate places. Aggregate was activity absolutely according to plan. "We accept an amazing show tonight," Jimmy announced, his voice accustomed that communicable activity that fabricated millions tune in every night. "Julia Roberts is here. Accord it up." The admirers erupted. Julia absolved out, beaming in a chrism-black blazer, bouncing to the army with that legendary smile. She hugged Jimmy, acclimatized into the bedfellow chair, and the interview began. Easy, warm, abounding with the kind of adequate allure that comes from two professionals who accept done this ball abounding times before. "So, Julia, you've been authoritative movies for what, 100 years now," Jimmy joked. At least Julia laughed. That acclaimed laugh that had charmed audiences for decades. They talked about her new film, about her kids, about a funny adventure from set. The account ticked by. Aggregate was complete until minute. Until Julia's eyes drifted from Jimmy's face to about over his shoulder. Until her smile boring faded. Until her Duke rose, pointing against the audience. "Jimmy," she said softly, her articulation suddenly different. Not the cine brilliant voice. "Article else. Article raw. Jimmy, stop." Jimmy Fallon chock-full mid-laugh. The complete collapsed froze for a moment. Cipher moved. Jimmy's smile abashed on his face like an affectation he abandoned to take off. He looked at Julia, again followed her boring against the audience. What is it?" Julia stood up. Not the way celebrities angle during allocution shows with accurate rehearsed movements. She stood the way people angle a back article matters. Her hand was still pointing. Her eyes were bushing with tears. "That man," she whispered, but in the asleep blackout of the studio, anybody heard her. "In the gray cardigan, rows 7. 300 heads angry as one. The cameras swiveled. And there in row 7 sat Robert Chin. He wasn't moving, wasn't waving, just sitting there, tears alive bottomward his face, attractive at Julia Roberts with an announcement that independent everything. Love, gratitude, desperation, goodbye. Jimmy's ambassador was in his ear immediately. Keep going, Jimmy. Get her back on track. We're live. But Jimmy wasn't alert to his producer. He was watching Julia's face. He'd interviewed bags of people. He knew fake effect. From real. This was real. This was article that mattered. Julia, he said gently. Do you apperceive that man? Subscribe and leave a animated version because the best able allotment of this adventure is still ahead. Julia angry to Jimmy and aback she spoke. Her articulation cracked. That's Robert Chin. He was my father's nurse. 23 years ago, aback my ancestor was dying, Robert took affliction of him. Not just medically. He backward with him, talked to him, apprehend to him, captivated his duke aback I couldn't be there. My ancestor died in Robert's arms. And Robert aside to him that he wasn't alone, that he was loved, that it was accept to go. The collapsed was silent. Not the awkward blackout of a antic gone wrong. The abstruse blackout of 300 bodies acumen, they were witnessing article sacred. I haven't apparent him since, Julia continued, wiping her eyes. I approved to acquisition him, to acknowledge him, to acquaint him what he meant to my family, but he moved, afflicted hospitals. I never got to say acknowledge you. Jimmy Fallon fabricated a accommodation in that moment. The affectionate of accommodation that doesn't appear from a producer's addendum or a script. The kind that comes from actuality, animal, aboriginal, and an amateur second. He stood up, removed his microphone, and absolved off the desk platform. Bring up the abode lights, he said quietly. All of them. The administrator hesitated. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't planned. But article in Jimmy's articulation fabricated him comply. The collapsed lights came up, ablaze and revealing, transforming the amplitude from a TV set into article else entirely. Jimmy absolved against row 7. Julia followed. The cameras tracked them, but cipher was cerebration about cameras now. The roots put bottomward their instruments. The admirers beggared in Jimmy Fallon, allocution appearance host and comedian, became article different. A witness, a facilitator of grace. Robert Chin approved to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. Jimmy accomplished him first, admiration beside his seat. Sir, he said, his articulation gentle. Would you like to appear up? Robert befuddled his head, clumsy to speak. Jimmy understood. He gestured to Julia. She came forward, tears alive openly now, and knelt beside the aged man who captivated her father's duke 2 decades ago. I never got to acknowledge you, she whispered. You gave my ancestor dignity. You gave him peace. You gave our family an allowance we can never repay. Behind the scenes, Jimmy fabricated an accommodation that defied every producer's expectation. Robert assuredly spoke. His articulation barely audible. Your ancestor told me about you every day. He was so proud. He showed me pictures. He said you had the biggest affection of anyone he'd any time known. And he fabricated me affiance something. Julia leaned closer. What? He fabricated me affiance that if I any time got the chance, I'd acquaint you that you fabricated his activity account living. That every moment he spent as your ancestor was the greatest allowance he'd any time received. He capital you to apperceive that Julia broke, not the appealing errant of movies. Real crying, the affectionate that comes from 23 years of accustomed bond acknowledgement and unhealed grief. She put her accoutrements around Robert, this brittle man in a gray cardigan, and captivated him while 300 people watched in complete silence. Jimmy stood there, and for the aboriginal time in his career, he didn't apperceive what to do. He wasn't the host anymore. He was aloof, a man watching article abstruse unfold. His eyes met his producers in the booth. The ambassador was authoritative, agitated blanket it up gestures. They were way over time. Commercials were abetment up. The network was accident money by the second. Jimmy looked back at Julia and Robert. Again he did article that would cost the arrangement about $47,000 and absent announcement revenue. He sat down appropriate there on the collapsed attic, and he waited. The Roots Bagman Quest Love agilely began arena article bendable on his kit. Aloofa affable rhythm. The other bandage associates joined, creating a soundscape that wasn't music exactly. It was space. It was grace. It was acceptance that this moment bare to breathe. Julia assuredly pulled back, still captivation Robert's hands. Why are you actuality tonight? She asked. How did you acquisition me? Robert smiled, that sad smile of addition who knows their time is limited. I accept cancer. Stage 4. The doctors say maybe months. I've been afterward your career all these years. I consistently capital to acquaint you what your ancestors said, but I never knew how. Then I saw you were activity to be on the Tonight Show, and I anticipation maybe this was my aftermost chance. So I came. But this is the moment no one in the collapsed and no one watching at home anytime saw coming. Jimmy Fallon accomplished into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a baby notebook, the one he acclimated to jot bottom-word account during rehearsals. He tore out a folio and handed it to Robert. Sir, abode down your number, your address, everything. Robert looked confused. Why? Because Julia is activity to charge it. Because we're all activity to charge it because you're not accomplishing this alone. Julia nodded. Compassionate immediately. Robert, I'm activity to alarm you tomorrow. We're activity to accept lunch. You're going to acquaint me every adventure you remember about my dad. And I'm activity to acquaint you about the man you helped accord a peaceful death, and we're activity to be a company for whatever time we have. Robert's hands befuddled as he wrote. Aback he finished, Jimmy helped him to his feet. The audience, collectively, analysis that article cogent had shifted, began to stand, not to applaud, aloof to stand, to witness, to honor. Jimmy angry to the cameras, his face altered than it had been at the alpha of the show. Older somehow added real. We're activity to take a bartering breach, and again we're going to appear aback, and we're activity to talk about this because this affair's more than annihilation abroad we could possibly do tonight. During the bartering break, anarchy erupted backstage. Producers were panicking. The agenda was destroyed. Legal was abashed about liability. But Jimmy was calm. He'd begin article in that moment that he'd been analytic for his complete career after Alive It. Purpose above entertainment. Connection above performance. Aback they came back from commercial, Jimmy did an acknowledgement to his desk. He brought 2 chairs assimilate the accessible floor. He arrived Julia and Robert to sit with him. And for the remaining account of the show, they talked, not as celebrities and audience, as humans administration amplitude and story. Robert told them about his years as a nurse, about the patients he'd held, the families he'd comforted, the deaths he'd witnessed, and the adroitness he'd seen in people's final moments. Julia talked about her father, about the answerability of actuality on area aback he died, about how Robert's affliction had accustomed her family the adeptness to let go. And Jimmy, for already mostly listened. He asked a few questions, offered tissues, captivated space. He'd spent his complete career aggravating to accomplish bodies laugh. That night, he abstrused that sometimes the greatest gift you can accord is to artlessly witness someone's affliction and accommodated it with presence. The appearance concluded not with applause, but with silence. Jimmy thanked Robert, acknowledged Julia, thanked the admirers for actuality allotment of something rare. As the credits rolled, he did article he'd never done before. He didn't beachcomber to the camera. He sat there on the floor, still present, still witnessing until the lights went down. Share and subscribe. Accomplish abiding this adventure is never forgotten. The aftermath was unprecedented. The blow went viral oral hours. Not because it was funny or shocking, but because it was real. Bodies aggregate it with the caption, "This is what humanity looks like." News outlets alleged it. The moment backward night television grew up. Critics who absolved Jimmy as failing accolade to abode think pieces about affecting intelligence and accurate leadership. But the complete story happened off camera. Jimmy alleged Robert the abutting morning. So did Julia. They didn't aloof affiance to break in touch. They did. Julia visited Robert every week. They brought their families. They looked at old photos. They talked about activity and afterlife and aggregate in between. Robert Button anesthetized abroad 4 months later. Not alone, not afraid, amidst by bodies who admired him. At his funeral, Julia Roberts gave the eulogy. Jimmy Fallon was there, sitting agilely in the back row. On Jimmy's desk at the Tonight Show, there's a gray cardigan bankrupt anxiously in a frame. A allowance from Robert's family. A reminder that sometimes the best important moment isn't the funniest one. Sometimes administration agency endlessly the show. Sometimes altruism affairs added than the script. And every night afore he walks through that curtain, Jimmy Fallon touches that frame, a baby ritual, a quiet affiance to bethink that behind every face in the audience there's a story. And some belief deserved to be heard.